Welcome to State of Ed, a podcast about education inside the classroom and out. My name is Marc Isix.
And I'm Nick Simone.
How you doing today, Nick?
Very excited today. How are you doing?
I'm very excited as well. This is actually the first time that we're talking face to face. So this is hopefully this goes well, and the mics actually pick up what they're supposed to pick up. But I know we're both very excited to have a very special guest today. It's Dr. Carol Burris, and Carol is the executive director of the Network for Public Education Fund, which is a nonprofit organization which was begun by Diane Ravitch, and that was to advocate for public education. She's also the co-director of the Schools of Opportunity Project at the National Policy Education Center, which is located at the University of Colorado. She was also she was also the principal of Southside High School and Rockville Center for 15 years, from 2000 to 2015. And as principal, she was a recipient of many awards, including the New York State High School Principal of the Year. She's also the author of 3 books on educational equity and numerous articles and professional journals on equity and fighting back corporate reforms. She's also frequently a guest blogger on the Washington Post, which is Valerie Strauss's column, The Answer Sheet. And I feel very inadequate now that I've read
I feel like
Dr.
I wanna
Burris's
clap. Am I
resume,
allowed to clap?
because I feel like I've done nothing. But Carol, welcome very much to State of Ed. We're very happy to have
Thank
you
you
here.
very much for having me.
So let's jump right into it. You are very much a part of the pushback to the quote unquote reform movement over the past decade, maybe even a little bit longer now at this point. How has education changed over your years working in the public school system?
Oh, wow. The changes have been dramatic. I mean, I think they've really accelerated in probably the last 5 or 6 years here in New York State, where um, I think we were all almost hit over the head when all of a sudden everything started happening, from the Common Core to new graduation standards to the evaluation of teachers by test scores. And it started to feel as though, at least here on Long Island, the democratically controlled schools, the neighborhood schools that we loved, were being destroyed. That somebody else was starting to pull the strings and telling us what to do. And rather than getting direction from our community, that we felt as though we were constantly under fire. And there was no way that I was going to put up with that.
I think that's so perfectly said from the teacher standpoint, because that's how we feel. But now from your standpoint as an administrator, what did it do just to the stress of the job for you? I mean, as you saw the changes taking place.
Well, the stress was enormous. You know, I wasn't an easy principal, but darn it, it wasn't anybody else's place to tell me how to evaluate our teachers, how to supervise our teachers, and I certainly did not like the idea of them being evaluated by test scores. It was nonsense. It was just some sort of a voodoo formula that had been created, and I just was not going to put up with that whole idea of putting teachers on a bell curve and pitting one against the other, and what was being said about teachers in the press. And I became very protective of my staff, very protective of the school, and of public education in general. So I was almost leading this split life, where I was spending, my day job, which as a principal is probably a 12-hour day job, running the school and taking care of business, and then spending all of my free time essentially fighting back by writing, by speaking out, and by standing up. And it was very hard in the beginning. There were a lot of people who did not like what I was doing. And there was a lot of opposition, but I feel that when you assume the mantle of the principalship, you're saying that you're a leader, and you got to lead. You can't just roll over and allow schools to be hurt and faculties to be destroyed by really terrible reforms.
One of the things that I dislike most about the reforms are that they put teachers in the equation when it really should be only students in the equation and taking care of what's important for the students' needs. But when you start to measure teachers' performance based on the tests that students take in teachers' classes, then the teachers now all of a sudden have a new stake in or a new or skin in the game, and they don't belong there. They shouldn't have that because it starts to split the attention and the focus, and the old saying, you can't serve two masters. By taking the emphasis off of the students, teachers are worried about their scores when they should be just worried about student performance and student achievement. That's hard enough. When you start to fold in self-preservation, that becomes much more difficult. Now, since we're talking about it, on the other hand, there should be accountability. I don't. There are lots of people who are not teachers, friends of mine, and when I speak to them, and they're very happy about APPR and the Common Core because they're under this, I guess, this misperception that teachers were previously not held accountable. Now, to be fair, there was, I guess, a misnomer or a misunderstanding out there in the world that teachers, once they had tenure, they were basically free to roam the earth as they so choose, and that good teachers and good schools, that was never the case. But there was this perception that it was, and so they were rejoicing when quote unquote accountability came into the picture. There were individuals who were not being held accountable, and they were not performing in the classroom as they should. So I guess what I'm trying to get at is, what's the right amount of reform? What's the right amount of accountability in your mind to sweep up the people who weren't playing ball or weren't playing fairly, and yet not punish the people who were doing the right thing?
Right. I mean, I always felt as a principal, that was my job to, if somebody wasn't doing their job, that became my job. We always had intensive supervision, for example, where we would work closely with a teacher, where the expectations were clear, where a colleague would join in usually, or somebody from the Teachers Association or the union. And then at the end of the day, the teacher would either choose to leave on their own, or if need be, there was due process, right? Now, the due process was a long process, and it was also very expensive. So, I mean, one solution could be to make it a little bit shorter while still protecting rights and make it a little bit less expensive. It was very interesting. A friend of mine was talking about a conversation of someone she knew that she had with Cuomo, Governor Cuomo. He goes, well, we need APPR because you know what? There are teachers who come to school drunk. Well, look, I don't know how many teachers come to school drunk, but how in the heck would APPR fix that
That's
problem?
right. I mean, there were surgeons coming to the operating room drunk, and name a profession.
Yeah, get a breathalyzer. I mean, it's silly. It's there always was accountability. There always was supervision. Maybe there were principals who weren't doing what they should have been doing, but there's no reason why APPR is suddenly going to make them do what they should be doing, which is, in my opinion, be the lead teacher. Be the teacher of teachers and put instruction first.
And you said before, you said you were a tough principal. And I think that's a great thing because we need good leaders, but we also need tough, just like teachers sometimes have to be a little bit more strict. But I feel like when this all happened, okay, the message has been sent. They want us to work harder. And maybe we were as a whole. I'm just talking now collectively in education. Maybe we were a little bit complacent. Maybe we needed to everybody, step up our game a little bit. But this was not the resolution. And that's my frustration, is that I feel like teachers will do what you ask them to do for the most part. And it sounds like in your situation, you encourage teachers to work hard, care about kids. But if you're telling teachers the only thing that matters is the test, then that's really what they're going to focus their emphasis on. That's my sadness, that it's just not going to resolve the problems that we may have had when this all started.
No, I agree. And I think Marc said something that was very important before when he talked about the relationship between kids and teachers. And when you put the test scores in place, I mean, I saw that immediately. And so did a lot of principals, by the way. We wrote the principal's letter against APPR back in 2011. And by the end of about 6 months, we had over 1/3 of all of the principals in New York State say, this is madness. Don't do this. This is the wrong idea. Because, it's human nature. You look out in your class, and there's the kid who always has his head down on the desk, right? Or who doesn't come to school or who's late. You're going to look at that child, and you're going to say, well, that is a threat to my job. right?
Mm-hmm.
You're going to say, hey, that kid in my AP class, he really doesn't belong there. Rather than say, you know
Mm-hmm.
what? Let me give this kid a shot. Let me work with him. He's better off here, even if he doesn't get a 3 on the test. That's what you want. That was the equity that I believed in. And it was immediately obvious that APPR and the evaluation of teachers by test scores was going to be a big problem.
You know, it's funny that you mentioned that because I had almost an identical conversation with a friend of mine who works in the private sector. This is going back a few years when APPR first was launched. And he was one of the people who said to me, you know, that he was happy that accountability is back and this is a good thing. And he almost was sort of scoffing at me because he believed in that we lived in a consequence free environment, which is far from the case. So my immediate reply to him, he has 2 daughters, and I said, you know what? You can say what you want, but now they have just created a reason for teachers not to take a chance on your daughters.
Yep.
And that changed his entire demeanor because, and Nick, you're an AP teacher for many, many years. And I know one of the things that makes you a great teacher is your willingness to take risks and bring kids who are on the margin or maybe even below that margin into your AP, which gives them opportunities that they never would have had to be in a learning environment that they never would have had a chance to be in before. And they're always better for it. But if you had to worry, and you're not worried because you're as solid in your career as humanly possible, but if you had to worry, if you're that third year, second year untenured teachers teaching AP about taking that same child into your class at that point, you would balk at it because you're thinking about yourself first and not what's better for the child. And that's, for me, one of the greatest crimes of this whole
Yeah,
system.
this year we have several students in the AP program that have never taken an AP class before, and I'd love to hear your school's experience because I know um, it must have been maybe about 10 years ago. I visited your school to learn about your IB program, and I was very impressed with the way you approached the program and how you were trying to expand as many opportunities for kids as possible. So, do you want to talk a little bit about how the IB program, evolved into what it is today under your leadership?
Yeah, I mean, we did a lot of good reform, equitable reform, but we did it the right way, not the crazy way these reformers are trying to do it. We did it very gradually over time. First, by giving all kids the same ninth grade courses that were going to prepare them to make that choice.
So now in ninth grade, in the core academic subjects,
Yes,
all the kids were basically, it was, heterogeneous mixing,
yes,
right?
yes,
Okay, for English, math, science, and social studies.
yes.
Now, what about if kids had a Regents exam in that they would take the Regents as well together?
They would take the regents as well together. Now,
Okay.
if they fail the regents, then, like, for example, all of the kids in Rockville Center were accelerated in math. Well, if they fail the algebra regents, then they had to take a repeater
Okay.
algebra. So they were not in geometry.
Gotcha.
Now,
Okay.
that was not a lot of kids.
Right, right.
Um, but we did it over time. We made sure we had support classes so that the kids every other day were met with a teacher in a small group. It was a teacher's class.
Oh, nice.
And they had the support that they needed to be successful. Then we gradually moved it into 10th grade, then into the 11th grade. So we really did it well over a decade, and we did it thoughtfully. We did it with a lot of support, a lot of care, and we saw some really excellent results. Um,
And that costs money. I mean, you have to
it,
put your
of
money where your mouth
course it
is in that, for
does.
sure. Yeah.
Yeah, it does. And this idea that, you can just yank up all the standards overnight and throw everybody in it and everything's going to be fine and it doesn't matter whether it's developmentally appropriate or not, that's absolute nonsense. So when I started seeing things like evaluating teachers by test scores, and I knew where we were going to create equity because about 16% of the kids at Southside are free or reduced price lunch kids. Then we have a lot of kids who are wealthy. I knew what would happen if everybody was evaluated by test scores. People would start to push back on that reform. I wanted to tell teachers, I don't care what the test scores are. The test scores are going to take care of themselves if you teach well. We want to give kids equitable experiences.
And did you get a lot of feedback? Because, see, my disappointment with where we are in education today is we're so data driven. And to me, Education is about the parent telling you, my child is doing so well in college thanks to the way you prepared them at Southside. Did you, as you expanded the IB access, I don't care how they did on the exams, and I'm sure they did very well because your school is very impressive, but did parents say that more kids felt prepared for college?
Oh, absolutely. Without a doubt. I mean, that was the crazy thing. I would look at what they thought was a college readiness standard. And
Hmm.
then we would do surveys and we'd see kids that were, a year later in college doing extraordinarily well. Um, they really did. And when I retired, I had parents. I was really very surprised and touched by how many parents came and thanked me for everything that we had done and said how we had given their child a chance that they would not have had anywhere else. And that's what true reform is about. Reform is about closing opportunity gaps.
Hmm.
You close gaps in opportunity, guess what? Test scores take care of
Hmm.
themselves. But when you're focused only on the test score and you give ridiculous tests, the new English Regents is bizarre.
Yeah,
It's
Hmm.
the AP exam
Hmm.
for all intents and
right.
purposes. Should not be a graduation test. When you have unrealistic standards, you don't build in time, you don't build in support, and then you make everybody worried that they're going to lose their job because of test scores, there's no way that's going to be successful.
And then at the 11th hour, they have these about faces in
Right.
judgment and reversals. Just last week, the New York State Board of Regents announced that they're going to walk back the 11th grade Common Core English requirement, and they're going to allow this grade to take the comprehensive English Regents, which is the 2005 standard. So everybody gets worked up, and then they start going in different directions or walking things back, and then you don't know. There's that moment of crisis. Well, do we jump ship on Common Core and get everybody ready for the comprehensive test, or do we keep going full steam ahead because we've already started
I
out
was
in
going to
that
say, let's
direction?
not forget the fact that we're 2 months into the school year.
Right.
So English teachers have already taught under the premise that they're giving one exam.
That's right. Well, I'll go even further and say that they're 2 years and 2 months into the school
Right.
year for
Yeah.
this particular test because they started making the changes 2 years ago when the state said that we would have to be accountable come 2016, which is what we did. And I think the sense of frustration that we feel, we've discussed it on the show before, and no doubt that you feel, I've read in your writing, is this inconsistency, this lack of foresight or thinking things through, taking into consideration many different factors and not just one single factor. And as a principal, that you can't just look at one possible outcome. You have to think about all the possible outcomes and try to mitigate against disaster striking and making a decision. And that comes from the way you do that is by getting people who know what they're doing and bring them together and trying to really brainstorm a thing through and not just look one or two chess moves down on the board, but as many as you humanly can. This hasn't done that. They looked at some numbers and said we're 20 whatever in math and 18 whatever or 19 in English compared to Singapore and Finland and so on. So we have to make changes now. But without taking into any consideration, well, what is life like in Finland? And what is life like for a school teacher in Finland and a child in Finland,
And how
or
big-
Beijing for that matter?
And how do the populations compare?
Yeah.
That's right. So, but they don't want to look at any of those other factors. They don't want to look at money. They don't want to look at inequality in income, in society, in neighborhoods, in schools. They just want to, magically close them and magically have everybody improve, which of course we all want. But this is not the way to get there, at least in this manner and with this type of execution and implementation. I know we definitely
Yeah.
agree with that around this
Yeah,
table.
it's very interesting too because I think about Southside High School, and we did a great job with kids who came from disadvantaged homes, who lived actually in a federal housing project in the district. There were so many resources. I had three social workers, three full-time social workers, two full-time psychologists. They were busy all the time. They
Hmm.
spent a lot of the time with disadvantaged kids. If Southside has that, what should a high school in Brooklyn have?
Hmm.
That has 98% of the kids on free or reduced
Hmm.
price lunch,
Hmm.
where 30% of the kids are English language learners.
Hmm.
And so the whole thing now is you go in, you shut down the school. Well, how do you make a school better by shutting it down? I'm missing the logic in that. And It really seems to be, Diane Ravitch is convinced, and I think I am now too, that what this really is, the bottom line is, this is a war against public education. They want to, the people behind it want to destroy unions. It's part of the
Mm-hmm.
game plan.
Mm-hmm.
They want to privatize education because it's a market, right? You remember Social Security, what was it? Supposed to be gone, right? By 2011, we had to privatize Social Security
Mm-hmm.
to save it, right? And George Bush told us, oh, we can't do this anymore. Well, guess what? 2011 came, and there was billions upon billions of dollars in excess funds. You don't hear anybody say a word. And then the focus shifted to us,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because that's how the marketplace works. It has to find new markets.
Mm-hmm.
It's how capitalism functions, for better or for worse.
Right.
They moved away from Social Security, and now the eyes are on public schools. You have private charter schools, private online charter schools. You have all kinds of technology being sold.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea that somehow, if the marketplace runs our neighborhood public schools, they will be better places.
And what there's so many upsetting things about that idea, but there are some really good initiatives that are taking place in education today, and I think that they all get lumped together. And I don't know what your feelings are about Common Core in general, but the concept to me of more student-centered learning and more critical thinking skills and more analysis and and trying to be less about factual recall, more about thinking. That's a great change for at least for me as a teacher that I love. I hate that it gets lumped together with all the APPR and the testing and what you're talking about, which is the attempt to take over education, because that doesn't because while we're all debating all these issues, kids are not stopping. They keep graduating in this system.
That's right.
And they're kids that are getting lost in the shuffle. So I don't know what your thoughts are on Common
Yeah.
Core in general, but
Well, I'm not much of a fan.
okay, that's fine.
Basically, I believe in the IB program, which is all about critical
Of course.
thinking. What I found in the Common Core, especially looking at the early years, not so much high school, but at the early years, that a lot of the curriculum was developmentally inappropriate. The math was extraordinarily confusing. There was too much of an emphasis on informational text and close reading. And what was happening was the teachers in my school, who were parents, were coming in with these worksheets, and they were having a fit.
Mm-hmm.
Their kids were crying,
Mhm.
and you know, I think that it was rushed. I think it was done quickly. I'd love to see the state really engage in a good examination of the Common Core standards and keep what's good and throw out what's not. But I don't know. It seems like somebody else is driving the bus. So
Right.
I'm not too hopeful with Cuomo's new commission. We'll see. We'll see.
I think part of the children crying has a lot to do with also parents and how parents are reacting to the changes. I think that their fears, their anxieties are being sort of presented to the children, and whereas if there was something difficult that I brought home when I was a student, my parents would try to help me work through it, even if they didn't understand it, and they would try to pull whatever resources they could or check the encyclopedias down in the basement. That was pretty much, there was no Google. But now the first reaction is in front of the kids to blame Common Core and to blame the tests and to blame. So there's first, before you dive in, there's the hand washing, and there's the I can't believe that this is happening and they're doing this to us and so on, as opposed to kind of digging in and figuring out how to make it work. And along with the lines of what Nick was saying, I feel like there's been this progression from over the last 20, 30 years where they watered down the standards because students weren't perhaps doing as well as they had wanted. The numbers weren't where people wanted them to be. So the state started to water things down. Just talking about New York State in particular, and where they went off the percentile and they went to the performance level, which was, I remember I was maybe just teaching a couple of years at the time, and instead of getting a 98 or a 97, you got a 1, 2, 3, 4. So I remember parents coming in so happy that their kid was number one, and then I'd have to explain that one is the worst. And that took years for people to kind of
Yeah.
reacclimate to the changes. But they did this to sort of bob and weave and move away from the real challenges. And while they were doing that, they were watering down the tests. And then and then along came, No Child Left Behind. And now all of a sudden you had to have certain numbers and make certain benchmarks. So teachers, they did what I guess the times forced them to do. They started watering down their lessons. They started watering down what they were trying to do in the classroom because they needed to get the kids ready for the test because the test took on a life of its own. And the problem is when you get your kids ready for a watered down test, then your instruction is watered down as well. So now the thing that I do like about Common Core and what Nick said before, at least it reintroduces what should have been there all along, which is a rigor, a high level, the expectation of high level of understanding and analytical skills develop, critical thinking skills develop, higher levels of cognition. Those are things that were supposed to be there all along. So, but they have been absent in many classrooms for such a long period of time that it almost is difficult to reintroduce it because people are used to this watered down version of a test, and now you give them something with rigor, and then not to mention you throw in a passage about a pineapple, and then people go crazy because that becomes the scapegoat,
Right.
and so the poor implementation becomes the scapegoat, and deservedly so. But I think now people are trying to figure out how they can throw away the baby with the bathwater, and I'd like to retain some of the good things that are coming out of this and leave all of the damaging and negative things behind. I don't know what your thoughts are about
Yeah,
that.
well, it's very interesting because NAEP, the NAEP scores just came out,
Hmm.
and they were a train wreck.
I know
You
this
know,
is in your latest blog post. Yeah.
yeah, they were on 3 of the 4 tests. We had a drop. Math, both the 4th and the 8th grade, and then the one test that it didn't drop, it was flat. And that hadn't happened in a long time. We were making actually pretty good, steady progress. Some of the best progress actually happened during the era of desegregation in the 70s and the 80s. You want to see something close the gap? Do
Hmm.
that,
Hmm.
right? And they were just a mess. And it was very interesting because if you listen to the Bill Gates and all of the other folks, all of these things, right, was supposed to make NAEP scores better.
Hmm.
Everybody was upset about proficiency rates on NAEP. So, I think we're starting to see the warning signs or the evidence that what they're doing is not working.
Hmm.
Now, if Common Core had been rolled out in a sensible way and all of this other stuff wasn't around it, might it have been better? I'm not sure. I'm not as certain as you are. While I see the need for critical thinking and for demanding an enriched curriculum, um, but you know what? We're never going to know
That's
that
right.
now because there has been so many distractors and so many negative things, and we're losing a generation of kids.
Hmm.
Yeah.
I'm without a doubt we are losing a generation of kids, and those NAEP scores, that's the canary in the mine. I mean, that really says something when all of a sudden scores take a dive the way those scores did.
Yeah, well, the math was probably the worst aspect of it. I mean,
Yes.
I agree with that.
and I teach social studies, but I never understood why you would introduce math to a fifth grader differently when it was taught from kindergarten to fourth. To me, that is about as common sense a
That's
decision.
right.
And I don't know why you wouldn't, if you wanted
Especially
to change
math.
it. Yeah,
Yeah.
Especially math.
Oh,
if
yeah.
you wanted to change it, then just start with kindergarten, class of 20, whatever that would be, 20, 25. But why you would introduce it? I mean, I have students now who are telling me that half of them are prepared for the new math SAT, but the other half in the
That's
junior
crazy.
class are prepared for the old, because if you're advanced, you actually are not being taught for the new math SAT. So they're like caught in the middle. I mean, these are issues, and the kids know it. They say it too. So that's definitely troubling. Again, we can move on, but the student-centered learning, that's always been a big focus for me, because I think we've lost so many kids coming in here expecting them to just copy notes off of a board, rote memorization. And that's been something that I have been happy with, that more teachers now are understanding, the need to develop the skills in the class. So.
Carol, you mentioned before you're working with Diane Ravitch and her group. To what extent are you working with Diane Ravitch?
A lot. But I have to probably end this really shortly because we have a meeting coming up pretty quickly.
Oh, okay.
It's the Network for Public Education. We have a lot of members. We're continuing to grow. We have a great convention every year in April. This year we're having it in North Carolina. I'm the executive director of the MP Fund, which is the C3 or the nonprofit side of the organization. And I just continue to write. We're working on a national report card, which we're really excited about, grading all of the states on their support for public education.
Oh,
wow.
Sort of the opposite of Michelle Rhee and Student First. And
Oh, wow.
yeah, a big part on teacher professionalism. We have some researchers at the University of Arizona we worked with, and that report should be coming out probably around January. We do newsletters. I do a lot of speaking now, interviews like this. My belief is that we cannot compete with the money. But what we can do is try to change minds and hearts so that for every person who listens to this program, well, maybe their opinion changes, just the way your friend's opinion changed about APPR. And then they will get their relatives and friends' opinions to change. And then the polls change. And we've certainly seen that in New York, huge shifts in the polls. And that's the only other thing other than money that politicians listen to. So that's the hope.
Wow, that's great.
I'd like to segue into our second segment. We do a segment called the Methods Lab, which is basically an opportunity to talk about things that apply to the classroom more directly. So, since you've been a principal, you were a principal for 15 years, and clearly you've gone into your share of classrooms. So, can you just take us through the observation process as you see it, and what makes for a good, effective observation process?
Yeah, but you know what? I'm a very old-fashioned principal. Or I was an old-fashioned principal. I was trained in part by Madeline Hunter.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and who really believed in clinical supervision, not in evaluation, but really working and coaching teachers, and focusing on a variety of aspects in the lesson. She was great. She would used to say that there was nothing that any teacher ever had to do in any lesson except think. That was her one rule. So the kinds of things that I would look for is I would look for active engagement kids. Right? Were they on task? Were they paying attention? Were they responding? Were the questions thoughtful? Were the questions scaffolded? Was there a little bit of differentiation in the lesson? If nothing else, if just in the questions that the teacher asked, was there time for kids to work together and to ponder and to think? Was the lesson clear? If a lesson is clear, if there's clarity, that makes such a difference. It really does. Um, did it look like the lesson was planned, right? Or somebody was just walking through the door and doing it on the fly. I mean, you knew that right away. And over the years, I think I was a good teacher, but over the years, I just saw so many great teachers, and I learned so much from them. And that's a part of the job that I really miss. There's no perfect formula. And certainly in these god-awful matrices and rubrics,
Right.
where everything is check boxes, that's not the way to help teachers get better. Not at all. It's really very, very sad what's happening in the profession. But I believe in that clinical model where you watch the lesson, you watch kids, you script it, and then you sit down, you have a rich conversation with the teacher and brainstorm, what the great moments were and what were the things that maybe they would do differently next time.
What kind of questions do you ask a teacher, or did you ask a teacher when you sat down to have that post-observation conference?
Oh my gosh, we would talk about, well, did the kids get it? What do you think? Do you think you achieved your objective, right? How did you know? What were some of the clues? Now, and then we talk about individual things that happened during the lesson, like, I noticed that when you asked that particular question, um, that kid really struggled with it, seemed to get it, but didn't, what kind of a follow-up question might you have asked to help him arrive at the answer? Um, Talk about different moments in time, or how, if you had to, if you were thinking about reordering the sequence of what you were doing in the lesson, how might you have done that? Time spent on homework, things like that. It's very hard to do it without the context
Of
of the
course, of
lesson.
course.
If you go into an observation, post-observation conference, and you have the same questions that you pull out, then it's not an authentic conversation.
And since we're talking about observations, what are your thoughts about the state's plan to bring in outside observers as part of the new APPR Part 4 or Part D?
Yeah, yeah, I think it's moronic. I see absolutely no benefit to it. I was appalled. I mean, that was probably one of the things that pushed me right over the edge into retirement, and I mean that literally. The idea of me going down to a kindergarten class in the district and observe it. Well, what the heck do I know about kindergarten? Or have an elementary principal walk into our IB physics class. It's nonsense. It's all sound and fury. It signifies nothing. It was some idiotic idea that Bill Gates had, and then everybody, and it's this whole thing, that this belief that Cuomo and others have, that we're all in cahoots, right? And that principals are scaredy afraid of their teachers and they're not honest, so you have to bring somebody else in. You don't know the person, you've never seen them teach before, you don't understand the curriculum. It's absolute nonsense. It's going to be a checklist. It's a
Right.
waste of valuable time. That's what makes me so angry about this. I had to observe every teacher twice, right? A formal observation twice. Well, you know what? I love doing observations, but there are some master teachers that don't have to be seen twice a year. I want to spend my time with the people who need me, but I couldn't because I had to meet the letter of the law. And the thought of getting in my car and going into some elementary school, and it just was just utter silliness, utter silliness.
I appreciate the Macbeth reference, by the way. It wasn't lost on me, so thank you. It was one of my favorites. And I also appreciate you coming out here and making the trip to join us this afternoon and speak with us. And
I thank you very much for taking the time, and thank you for all the hard work you're doing. I mean, you've benefited so many kids in the Rockville Center School District, but now hopefully you're going to continue to have an impact on everybody else.
Well, I'm doing my best. And to the two of you, I thank you for your service.
Oh, thank you very much.
very
So,
much.
our usual boilerplate here at the end. If you'd like to follow us on iTunes, you can subscribe to us at State of Ed. Just do a search. You can also find us on the web at stateofedpodcast.com. If you have a question, you can ask it at ask@stateofedpodcast.com. You could also find us on Twitter at SOE Podcast, and we're also going to put some links to some of Carol's work on our website. So please feel free to go to our website and read some of her work. She's really right on point and doing a lot of tremendous work on all of our behalf. So again, thank you so much, Carol, for your time, and thank you, Nick, and I'll see you again next time.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Thanks.